Okay, so we're back with Thomas Taylor's translation of Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus. We're doing this publicly as opposed to the other works in this Eomplacian curriculum that we're doing because there's no publicly available audiobook of this work, and it's a very important one. I've seen it written that this is maybe like the kind of key text of Neoplatonism as a whole. It's certainly important for understanding Proclus's whole system. If you'd like to join the reading group generally, check out the description. You can sign up on Subscribestar. We also have a Neoplatonism group and a group that's doing Aristotle. We're also streaming that publicly at the moment as well. But if you want to tune in for the other stuff that does not go on this channel, then you can sign up there. All right, so we are at this quote from the dialogue. Besides, we all know that Critias is not ignorant of any of the particulars of which we are now speaking. So Proclus was just talking about the criteria that Socrates is looking for someone to be able to bring his ideal state to life. And essentially, they need to be politically oriented, and also they have to have attained the heights of philosophy. So Timaeus and Hermocrates were both involved in government in their hometowns, as well as being conversant in philosophy. Critias, likewise, has philosophical interests, but was very politically active in Athens. So that's why these three auditors are the appropriate ones to fulfill the task that Socrates is setting for them. So Proclus: Critias indeed was of a generous and grand nature. He likewise engaged in philosophic conferences and was called, as history informs us, an idiot among philosophers, but a philosopher among idiots. Interesting. Okay. He tyrannized also, being one of the 30. It is not, however, just to accuse Socrates on this account, because he now thinks him deserving of a certain praise. Okay. So it's not just to accuse Socrates for praising Critias when he was involved in the tyranny. That's probably part of the reason Socrates was executed, his extensive ties with the Spartan puppet regime that was installed in Athens, the 30 tyrants. Socrates says a lot of pro-Laconic things, pro-Spartan things in the dialogues. So perhaps it was less about his philosophical tendencies than just questioning his allegiance and what is his overall influence on the state. But Proclus says we shouldn't accuse Socrates for praising someone who is part of this infamous regime. For in the first place, we should not attend to the matter in which he praises him. We should attend to the manner in which he praises him. For he says that he is not ignorant of any of the particulars of which we are now speaking, both on account of his natural disposition and his association with philosophers. In the next place, we should observe that the tyrannical character is an argument of an excellent nature, as we learn from the fable in the 10th book of the Republic, which particularly leads souls descending from the heavens to a tyrannical life. So in one sense, the tyrant is the kind of worst life to have, but in another, you have to at least have some innate excellence to realize it. You can't be sort of a middle-of-the-row character and become a tyrant. For being accustomed there to revolve with the gods and to govern the universe in conjunction with them, in these terrestrial regions also they pursue apparent power, just as those who possess the remembrance of intelligible beauty embrace visible beauty. That Critias, however, pertains, according to analogy, to the middle fabrication of things, the demiurge of souls, in that demiurgic triad. Remember, Timaeus is the demiurge of wholes, or the exempt demiurge, and then Socrates is the intellective demiurge, Critias the demiurge of soul, and I believe Hermocrates would be demiurge of body. We have to examine that demiurgic triad more closely as we go. So Critias is the middle of that triad. He may be or rather that he pertains to the middle, may be learnt in the first place from his succeeding to the discourse of Socrates. Socrates representing the intellectual demiurge, then Critias is immediately following him as the soul demiurge. In the next place, from his narrating the Atlantic history, and the Atlantics being the progeny of Neptune, and in the third place, from his own proper life. Okay, so them being the progeny of Poseidon, I think, being the god of the oceans, is associated with a precession phase, where Zeus is associated more with an intellective phase. So I guess Critias being that middle position in the triad of demiurges, he represents the kind of precession aspect. Right? In all these trinities, we have the abiding, preceding, reverting. And so I guess the association with Poseidon gives that kind of precessing aspect. And in the third place, from his own proper life. And I'm not sure exactly what's meant by that, but we'll see. For the ruling particularity, and that which extends to many things, are the characteristics of this life. Okay, so Critias's political nature shows his embodying the precessing aspect of this demiurgic trinity, I suppose. Power likewise pertains to media, and therefore he possesses the middle place in the encomiums. For to assert of him that he was not one of the vulgar, but a partaker of the prerogatives of Timaeus, shows his inferiority to the first person of the dialogue, but that he was not entirely removed from him indicates his alliance to him. Okay? Nor is this, so next quote, nor is this to be doubted of Hermocrates, since a multitude of circumstances evince that he is, both by nature and education, adapted to all such concerns. Proclus. Hermocrates was a Syracusan general, desirous of living conformably to law. Hence also he participates in a certain respect of the political science and philosophy. He must be referred, therefore, according to analogy, to the third fabrication of things. For, let's read this footnote 2. Timaeus is analogous to Jupiter, the demiurge of the universe, but Socrates, Critias, and Hermocrates are analogous to the three ruling fathers, or demiurgi, Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. Right, okay. So Neptune, again, Poseidon is that preceding aspect. Jupiter here in the triad is the abiding aspect, and then Pluto will be the reverting aspect, or Hades. And we can see that theme being genuinely Platonic from the Phaedo, where Hades and death is also treated as a reversion of the soul, and it's also the purificatory dialogue in this curriculum. So yeah, it's important then that both the demiurge of wholes, Timaeus, and the demiurgic intellect, Socrates, have the same god representing them. So the demiurge of wholes is represented by Zeus, and then the trinity is Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. So there we go with that trinity. Got to remember that. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. Hades reversion. Makes sense with the way death is treated in the Phaedo. Poseidon precession. Makes sense with his association with the Atlanteans and other aspects of the myth. And then Jupiter is the intellective, and then also as the ruling power over the whole trinity. Okay? Who from the summit of the supermundane order of gods, or rather who form. Yeah, so they're the three ruling fathers, or demiurgi, Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto, who form the summit of the supermundane order of gods. For according to the arcana of the Grecian theology, there is a twofold Jupiter. So these footnotes are Thomas Taylor then. there is a twofold Jupiter, one being the demiurge and existing at the extremity of the intellectual order, but the other being the first of the supermundane demiurgic triad. Okay, so we'll see more of that in the 6th book of the Theology of Plato by Proclus. Platonic Theology is his main work. It's like 1,000 pages or something. Okay. And as far as the arcana of the Grecian theology, I assume that means Chaldean oracles. Generally, when they talk about the theologists or the theologians, they are talking about the Chaldeans. And of course, that's from Julian the Theurgist. They're actually a father and son who were both like inspired writers, I think in the 1st century AD. So that's where the oracles come from. And then you might also include the Orphic hymns. And the dating on those, I think, is more all over the place. We'll have to study the Orphic hymns at some point. We might find like a nice modern text that summarizes, what they contain, because they're pretty enigmatic as they stand. Okay. And we're up here. So Hermocrates must be referred, therefore, to the 3rd fabrication of things. So that is associated with Hades, and rules over the mundane fabrication, I guess, although that doesn't seem to accord too well with the idea of that 3rd being a reversion, because corporeality is the furthest extension, but just keep going. For the command of an army is a power allied to the god, who arranges the last and most disorderly parts of mundane fabrication, and to be testified by a multitude of circumstances indicates an analogy to the power that produces fabrication into all multitude and an ultimate division. Okay, so this trinity then doesn't work so well with the abiding, preceding, reverting theme. Yeah, it is instead being treated like one is most concentrated, the second, Demiurge of Soul, Poseidon, is more extended, and then the last is not a reversion back, but actually a further extension out. I don't know if that can be reconciled with the abiding, preceding, reverting theme. I just assumed that trinity would fit that, but from what he's saying here, no. Okay. So moving on. We therefore make this arrangement in order that the men may have an analogy to things. But others arrange Critias as inferior to Hermocrates, though the absent person was neither adapted to speak nor to hear, and of those that are present at a conference, he who is an auditor, indeed, but is silent, is secondary to him who is both an auditor and a speaker, and in this respect imitates those that are about Socrates and Timaeus. In the next place, this also must be considered, that Socrates gives the preference to Critias in what he says, praising him immediately after Timaeus. There are likewise those who attribute such an order as the following to these persons, viz., they arrange Timaeus according to the paradigmatic cause, Socrates according to the efficient, and Critias according to the formal cause, for he leads into energy those that have been rightly educated, but Hermocrates according to the material cause. Hence also he is adapted indeed to hear, but not to speak. And just because the causes were brought up well, first of all, what are the 6 Neoplatonic forms of causation? Does anyone remember?
I know, isn't it? Paradigmatic is one.
Yep. What are the 4 Aristotelian ones?
Efficient, material, formal, and final.
Right. Plus paradigmatic. And then the 6th one that Proclus doesn't mention.
Instrumental.
Instrumental. And what are the 3 that are termed, genuine causes? And then what are the 3 that are con causes? Genuine causes would be... Well, efficient is definitely one. paradigmatic, and final. So the authentic cause of something is its end, its archetype, and then the actual like creating act that brings it about. And so the con causes would be the instrumental, naturally, and then mundane, formal, and material. Okay. Which just means they don't act of their own accord. Like mundane form doesn't instantiate itself, it's instantiated by the paradigm at a higher level. Okay. Hence also he is adapted indeed to hear but not to speak. For matter receives productive powers externally, but is not naturally adapted to generate. And hence he doesn't speak. And this arrangement indeed will be found to be very reasonable if we abandon the former conceptions relative to the analogy of the men. Okay, next quote. Hence, when you yesterday requested me to discuss what pertains to a polity, I readily complied with your request, being persuaded that the remainder of the discourse could not be more conveniently explained by any one than by you, if you were but willing to engage in its discussion. For when you have properly adapted the city for warlike purposes, there is no one in the present age but you from whom it can acquire everything fit for it to receive. As I have, therefore, hitherto complied with your request, I shall now require you to comply with mine in the above-mentioned particulars. Nor have you, indeed, refused this employment, but have, with common consent, determined to repay my hospitality with the banquet of discourse. I now, therefore, stand prepared in a decorous manner to receive the promised feast. We looked earlier at how banqueting and sharing of food symbolized the sharing of intelligible contents between the forms, between the gods. So like nectar and the food of the gods symbolizes the intelligibles, not some like rarefied form of literal food. And banquet is used in multiple dialogues to refer to discourses like this. Gorgias referred to his presentations as I think banquets, and I think historically Plato also, when he would like present his dialogues or have his public exhibitions, would refer to those as banquets. Okay. Proclus, the summary repetition of the polity appears, indeed, as Socrates now says, to have been made for the sake of the discussion of the contests in war of a rightly constituted city. But the concise comprehension, however, of the polity and the Atlantic War refer us to the one fabrication of the world. Okay. So, yeah, this seemingly disconnected treatment of, on the one hand, this request of Socrates to see the city come to life in a contest, and then on the other, Timaeus goes into the fabrication of the world, and how exactly those are connected is not clear from the text, but we've already heard some thoughts about that. But for, as we have before observed, it is better, prior to the whole fabrication and all the form of the production of the world, to make a survey from parts and images. Right, he mentioned it was a Pythagorean thing to treat a subject iconically, or in terms of images, and then in terms of symbols, and then to give the theory directly. Okay, so he's saying basically the Atlantis story is subordinate to the purpose of establishing the one fabrication of the world. It's just interesting then that Socrates is explicitly asking for this enactment of the city, or dramatization of the city, but Proclus is implying that it was always for the sake of preparing this discourse about the fabrication of the world. Still not super obvious to me. But Socrates, therefore, resuming the polity in certain forms, and first, through this imitating the universe, very properly establishes himself, as it were, in essence, but excites others to the discussion, who celebrate the power of such a city, and imitate those who arrange the universe according to the middle demiurgic form, and uniformly comprehend the contrarieties and multiform motions which it contains. So Socrates, being the demiurgic intellect, keeps the nature of the ideal state in his essence concentrated, and then it falls to the next member of the triad to actually unfold it. And that's how creation generally works. Higher orders remain concentrated and contain what they disseminate proximately in themselves, and the dissemination is carried out on the part of kind of intermediary lower emanations. As therefore Jupiter in Homer, being seated in his citadel on the summit of Olympus and abiding in his own accustomed unity, sends the gods who preside over the mundane contrariety to the Grecian war, thus also Socrates, being purely established in the intelligible form of a polity, prepares those after him that are able to celebrate the motion and power of this polity, calling forth indeed the science of Timaeus to the survey of wholes totally, but preparing the others to the total and concise comprehension of partial natures. Okay. For as he had discussed, and another of those connections between the form of the universe and the form of the ideal state is just that the model of the ideal state is the model of the cosmos. So, like in the Republic, they talk about the importance of rearing a class of like mystic philosophers who are able to reach direct intuitive contact with the forms, with therefore the form of the ideal state. But Proclus is indicating here that the, I guess, more proximate archetype of the ideal state is the operation of the heavens itself. I don't know if that's explicit in the Republic. I bet it is, but next time we revisit the Republic, we'll bear that in mind. Okay, and so to really understand the energies of the ideal state, we're going kind of beyond it to its archetype, and also below it to its activities. So that makes sense. Then Timaeus represents that which is above the ideal state. Critias, that which is below it, in the sense of its energies are inferior to its essence. So it would make sense to really know it. We're going to go in both directions here. For as he had discussed the polity totally, after this manner also he wishes that the power of it should be celebrated by the rest. Since, however, all these discourses bring with them an image of demiurgic works, and the whole conference adumbrates the fabrication of the world, Socrates very properly says that he stands prepared in a decorous manner to receive the promised feast, his words being invested with modesty as a form adapted to virtue. All right, Hermocrates. But we, O Socrates, as Timaeus just now signified, shall cheerfully engage in the execution of your desire, for we cannot offer any excuse sufficient to justify neglect in this affair. For yesterday, when we departed from hence, and went to the lodging of Critias, where we are accustomed to reside, both in his apartment and in the way thither, we discoursed on this very particular. Proclus. It was requisite that Hermocrates should say something, and not be silently present, like the unemployed persons in a comedy. Hence also he is represented speaking to Socrates. And this indeed is logographic, or pertaining to the art of writing. But it is likewise adapted to what has been before said. Okay. So I guess what he's saying is it's like rhetorically or like stylistically appropriate, in a sense that it's fit for Plato's composition here, but then it's also fitting for the symbolic significance, I suppose. For it represents to us, as in an image, that the last parts of the fabrication of things follow the one Father of wholes, and through similitude to him converge to the one providence of the world. For Hermocrates, following Socrates, says that that nothing shall be wanting, either of alacrity, willingness, or power, to the accomplishment of the narrations investigated by Socrates. Okay. Okay, so here that reversion theme does come back up. So in this sentence up here, for it represents to us as in an image. So Hermocrates speaking and being willing to comply with Socrates shows that the last parts of the fabrication of things, Hermocrates being the kind of mundane demiurge or a corporeal demiurge, the last parts of the fabrication of things follow the one father of wholes, and through similitude to him converge to the one providence of the world. The text there has Hermocrates converging back to Socrates, which I guess makes sense. So you have the exempt, imparticipable demiurge of wholes that are prior to parts, and then the Trinity. I'm going to go ahead and stick with this idea that it is abiding, processing, reverting, because we have here the last member does disseminate, but also converges. So it's not kind of one or the other. And that is also where the demiurge of wholes is situated. Remember, we have being, life, intellect in the second hypostasis generally, and then within the intellect phase of the second hypostasis, we have another kind of being, life, intellect, namely Kronos, Rhea, and then Zeus. And that third intellect within intellect is the demiurge, who is also kind of the creator of the next hypostasis down. And so in that case, then, like, the intellect of intellect is disseminative, but also still revertive. So these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So Hermocrates, being the demiurge of mundane natures, contributes to dissemination of images, but also in so doing is still converging back to the one providence of the world, converging to the one father of wholes. And that, I guess it makes sense that it would revert to the abiding phase of his own Trinity. So in abiding, preceding, reverting, the reversion goes back to that abiding. It doesn't go back to the imparticipable demiurge of wholes beyond that. But the language in this sentence here is a little ambiguous, where it sounds like maybe saying Hermocrates is reverting back to the father of wholes, namely Timaeus, but I don't think so. All right. Keep going. For Hermocrates, following Socrates, says that nothing shall be wanting, either of alacrity or power, to the accomplishment of the narrations investigated by Socrates. For these two things become especially impediments to us in our mutual energies, viz., our indolence and any external impediment. Right. So why do we not do things? Because we're not willing to, or because we're prevented by some lack of power, or a greater power that opposes us. Removing, therefore, both these, he says that there cannot be any excuse sufficient to justify their neglect or prevent them from accomplishing the mandate of Socrates. Very properly, therefore, does he call upon Critias for the narration respecting the city of the ancient Athenians, in which the mandate of Socrates terminates, just as Socrates calls on Timaeus and makes himself a partaker of his discourse. For on the preceding day, Hermocrates says, they discoursed on this very particular together with Critias, just as the third demiurge in the universe communicates with the production of the second. Right. So the demiurge of mundane natures communicates with the production of souls, or the demiurge of souls. For the whole of generation is entirely in want of returns from the subterranean world. Let me see. What is the meaning of that? If, however, these things subsist after this manner, the Atlantic history will appear to have had the third narration. But those numbers, the dyad and the triad, are said to be adapted to the middle fabrication, the former through power, and the latter through its demiurgic providence, and which is also perfective of mundane natures. Okay, so the dyad symbolizes the indefinite dyad, unlimited power, I guess, like the archetype of power, strictly speaking, and energy as well. So then the dyad and triad are both fit to symbolize the middle fabrication. Okay, and the triad because it symbolizes providence. Interesting. Going back to this sentence, for the whole of generation is entirely in want of returns from the subterranean world. Does anyone have a guess as to what's meant there? I guess, like, so as the connection is between souls that are descended into generation going above the world of generation, and seeing as that's wanting from above through providence and from below through a desire for the return to their source. So the whole of generation is in want of returns from the subterranean world. Okay, Hades, being that Hermocrates is symbolized by Hades, there's the association with the underworld, and I think the connection between Hermocrates and Critias is meant to then symbolize, I guess, the return of souls from the underworld up to either another birth, or you could think of, like, if this whole world is a kind of Hades, then a return from this world up to the true world, like we see in the myth from the Phaedo as well. Okay, we will just keep going. So that whether you assign to this history a double or a triple narration, you will, from either of the numbers, be able to recur to the conception of the intervening medium. Okay. Next quote, he therefore narrated to us the following particulars from ancient rumor, which I wish, O Critias, you would now repeat to Socrates, that he may judge whether it in any way conduces to the fulfillment of his request. Critias, it is requisite to comply, if agreeable to Timaeus, the third associate of our undertaking. Timaeus, I assent to your compliance. Proclus, you will find in these words an admirable indication, as in images, of divine natures. For as in them, such as are secondary call forth the prolific powers of such as are primary, and produce them to the providential inspection of the subjects of their government. Thus also here Hermocrates calls on Critias to speak, and gives completion to what was promised to Socrates. And as among divine natures, effects convert themselves to the reception of their causes, thus also here Hermocrates is extended to Critias, but Critias looks to the mandate of Socrates. So they're all converting back to their cause. As likewise, all demiurgic causes are suspended from the one Father of the universe and govern all things conformably to his will. After the same manner, here also all the persons fly to Timaeus, and to his nod, or consent, or will, in order that, being impelled from that as from a root, they may dispose their narration agreeable to his desire. For thus, what is going to be said will contribute to the discourse about the whole fabrication of the world. Moreover, the words, from ancient rumor, if the narration is historical, signify ancient according to time. But if they are an indication of what takes place in the universe, they will obscurely signify the reasons or productive powers which are from eternity inherent in souls. And if likewise they bring with them an image of divine causes, they show that these demiurgic causes, being supernally filled with more ancient gods, impart also to secondary natures their own providential energies. Okay, so talking about that ancient rumor, if we treat the Atlantis story historically, is ancient in time. If we treat it symbolically, then we have things that are prior in time signifying what is prior in the ontological hierarchy. So what is ancient would be like the principles, reason principles of the soul that are that go into making the soul the way it is. Okay. Or we can interpret it even theologically, not necessarily what is prior being a prior principle, but also the prior gods are contained in lower gods, not contained in the same way. So, of course, what is lower contains what is higher in the manner of an image. What is higher contains what is lower in the mode of causal containment, or as a seed. I think we can go on. Next quote, Critias, hear then, O Socrates, a narration surprising indeed in the extreme, yet in every respect true, which was once delivered by Solon, the wisest of the 7 wise men. With respect to the whole of this narration, I'm afraid my screen capture has been kind of messed up with the text. Apologies. Okay. With respect to the whole of this narration about the Atlantics, some say that it is a mere history, which was the opinion of Crantor, the first interpreter of Plato, who says that Plato was derided by those of his time as not being the inventor of the Republic, but transcribing what the Egyptians had written on this subject, and that he so far regards what is said by these deriders as to refer to the Egyptians this history about the Athenians and Atlantics, and to believe that the Athenians once lived conformably to this polity. Crantor adds that this is testified by the prophets of the Egyptians, who assert that these particulars, which are narrated by Plato, are written on pillars which are still preserved. Right. That's the main reason to believe Crantor did believe the narrative was historical. He says that these stories are still recorded on pillars surviving in Egypt. Later authors don't talk about these pillars, so was Crantor making it up? Harold Tarrant, in his introduction to this, to his translation of this commentary, says that Crantor may have been being ironic in saying that, because the Egyptians had a bad reputation as liars, apparently. And so that's one of the reasons that Plato was derided for copying Egyptian methods in his ideal polity. And so in saying that, oh, the Egyptians have records of it, Tarrant thinks Crantor was being ironic, and he really meant that, yeah, like, oh, those liars over there have this story, indicating actually that the story is false, not true. Proclus doesn't pick up on any irony like that. I think it is kind of tenuous. So I think we can treat Crantor as the oldest witness outside of Plato that this is a genuine story. Others, again, say that this narration is a fable and a fictitious account of things which by no means had an existence, but which bring with them an indication of natures which are perpetual or are generated in the world, not attending to Plato, who exclaims, quote, that the narration is surprising in the extreme, yet is in every respect true. So Proclus wants all senses, then, of the narration, historical as well as symbolical, to be true. For that which is in every respect true is not partly true and partly not true, nor is it false according to the apparent, but true according to the inward meaning, since a thing of this kind would not be perfectly true. Others do not deny that these transactions took place after this manner, but think that they are now assumed as images of the contrarieties that pre-exist in the universe. For war, they say, is the father of all things, as Heraclitus also asserted. And of these, some refer the analysis to the fixed stars and planets, so that they assume the Athenians as analogous to the fixed stars, but the Atlantics to the planets. They likewise say that these stars fight on account of the opposition in their circulation. This might have been Amelius, by the way, who held that. Fixed stars being Athens, planets being Atlantis. Proclus himself seems to want to read it as the Athenians being the celestial region and Atlantis being the sublunary region, interpreted as a cosmic icon. I'm sure there's also like deeper theological symbolism to draw out. They likewise say that these stars fight on account of the opposition in their circulation, but that the fixed stars vanquish the planets on account of the one convolution of the world. Of this opinion, therefore, is the illustrious Emelius, right, who vehemently contends that this must be the case, because it is clearly said in the Critias that the Atlantic island was divided into 7 circles. But I do not know of any other who is of the same opinion. Others, again, as Origen, refer the analysis to the opposition of certain daimons, some of them being more, but others less excellent. Right, so these are Atlantis and Athens, 2 different levels of the order of daimons that are in conflict. Origen and Emelius were both students of Numenius, so some of the last Middle Platonists, and some of them being superior in multitude, but others in power. Okay, so fewer but more powerful daimons versus a more multitudinous but inferior order of daimons. Some of them vanquishing, but others being vanquished. But others refer it to the discord of souls, the more excellent being the pupils of Minerva. But so more excellent souls being the students of Athena. Okay. But the inferior kind being subservient to generation. So the Athenian philosophical soul versus the Atlantic corporeally invested soul. So similar to the idea of Origen of the different orders of daimons, but instead apply that to souls. And of course, daimons are one subset of souls as well, although sometimes when people are referring to souls, they're really talking about mortal souls specifically, and they'll refer to daimons as spirits, although they're all in the 3rd hypostasis, the hypostasis of soul generally. So typically they would have angels on the top and then daimons as a middle and then mortal souls as the 3rd, is that trinity within the 3rd hypostasis. But the inferior kind being subservient to generation, who also pertain to the god that presides over generation, i.e. to Neptune. Okay, so superior with Athena, appropriate to the myth or history, and then Atlantics related to generation, presided over by Poseidon once again. And this is the interpretation of Numenius. Okay. Right. So 2 orders of souls, Athenian and Poseidonian souls. Others, mingling as they fancy the opinions of Origen and Numenius together, say that the narration refers to the opposition of souls to daimons, the latter drawing down, daimons drawing down, but the former being drawn down. Okay, so this is like inferior materially invested daimons associated with the West being Atlantean, and then souls resisting that drawing down by corporeally invested daimons being the Athenians, I suppose. And with these men, daimon has a triple subsistence, for they say that one kind is that of divine daimons, another of daimons according to habitude, to which partial souls give completion when they obtain a daimonical allotment, and another is that of depraved daimons, who are also noxious to souls. Okay. So partial souls give completion to daimons according to habitude. I'm not exactly sure how to interpret that. And another is that of depraved daimons who are noxious to souls. So I guess divine daimons would be complete altogether. And then daimons according to habitude would be like an incomplete order of daimons that are intermediate, that are completed when souls obtain a daimonical allotment. So they participate of daimonical energies and are daimons by participation, but they're not daimons by their essence, I suppose. And so, another Neoplatonic principle is that in all of these orders of being, you move from the more complete and whole to the more incomplete and partial. So there will be partial daimons that are not complete souls. Damascius talks about this in his commentary on the Phaedo as well. So, yeah, you have these kind of... Excuse me, I have a problem with my tongue at the moment. Just a little sore on the side of it. It's annoying. Yeah, so you have these kind of partial daimons that are not complete souls in themselves, and then souls, complete souls, maybe mortal souls, which participate of those daimonical habits, then energize daimonically and can actually be improved, I would say, by that middle order. The divine daimons being whole, separate. I'm just kind of guessing this is how this would flesh out. And then the depraved daimons, who are noxious to souls, those would be so incomplete that they can't be like brought into a complete mortal soul to allow it to energize higher. So it looks like complete divine daimons, incomplete according to habit, that could still be lived up to elevate souls, and then incomplete that are noxious to souls, so that they would be the most partial and most multitudinous. These would be like low-level demons that would exert influences, negative influences on souls, whereas the more complete middle order of daimons would be like, genius, or inspiring daimon, or something like being inspired by a muse. So that'd be the difference there, which makes sense. Daimons, therefore, of this last kind, wage this war against souls in their descent into generation. Right. So these most partial daimons are at war with souls, prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Reminded of like the prayer to Saint Michael there. And that, say they, which ancient theologists refer to Osiris and Typhon, or to Bacchus and the Titans, this, Plato, from motives of piety, refers to the Athenians and Atlantics. So this last class of interpreters who combine Numenius with Origen interpret it that this is the same basic struggle that's found in Dionysus and the Titans, or Osiris and Typhon. Not sure about the myth exactly involving Osiris and Typhon. Okay, and so this is just another rearticulation of this same perennial theme about these like lower daimons attacking more complete souls. Before, however, souls descend into solid bodies, these theologists and Plato deliver the war of them with material daimons who are adapted to the West. Since the West, as the Egyptians say, is the place of noxious daimons. Okay. And we've seen this before, the West being associated with the inferior, because the sun sets in the West, so it's associated with darkness and the descent of souls. But then, by the same token, there are stories of like the Hesperides, Blessed Isles, being in the West as well. So the symbology is not consistent in all Hellenic literature, but there are other sources that treat the West in general as like less solar, the East as more solar, because that's where the sun rises out of. Okay. So before souls descend into solid bodies, there's a war between those souls and material daimons. So this is a battle that the soul has to go through, I suppose, after a life, before the next incarnation. Sounds like. Of this opinion is the philosopher Porphyry, respecting whom it would be wonderful if he asserted anything different from the doctrine of Numenius. These philosophers, however, are, in my opinion, very excellently corrected by the most divine Iamblichus. Okay. So, Numenius's opinion, once again, was 2 orders of daimons. Origen had 2 orders of soul, and then who combined the 2 opinions? Others who go unnamed combine the 2, and then it's daimons versus souls. But then it's interesting that he says Porphyry agrees that this is about the war of daimons and souls, which was a combination of the Numenian and Origenist position, but then says that Porphyry would never disagree with Numenius. So there seems to be a slight incoherence here, in that if Porphyry really didn't differ from Numenius in any respect, then he would have the interpretation that this is 2 different orders of daimons that are battling, that are symbolized. But all right, how does Iamblichus correct all this? According to him, therefore, and also to our preceptor Syrianus, this contrariety and opposition are not introduced for the purpose of rejecting the narration, since on the contrary, this is to be admitted as an account of transactions that actually happened. But, as we are accustomed to do, we must refer that which precedes the subject of the dialogue to the scope itself of the dialogue. Hence, they are of opinion that this contrariety, which is derived from human affairs, should, according to a similar form, be extended through the whole world, and especially through the realms of generation. That, in consequence of this, we should survey everywhere how things participate of contrariety, according to the variety of powers. Okay, so I'm gathering that the symbolism should be of the whole of generation, because that's the scopos of the dialogue. So we shouldn't just be talking about certain orders of souls if the topic of the entire work is the entire universe from top to bottom. For since all things are from the one, and from the dyad after the one, are in a certain respect united to each other, and have an opposite nature, as in the genre of being there is a certain opposition of sameness to difference, and of motion to permanency, but all things participate of these genera. This being the case, we must survey after what manner mundane natures possess the contrariety which pervades through all things. So everything subsequent to the monad and the dyad contain a certain contrariety. So it's not just generated natures that subsist out of a kind of enantiodromia, or generation from opposites. Even the henads in the first hypostasis contain those 2 oppositional forces, the monad, principle of limit, and indefinite dyad, principle of the unlimited. Okay. So the war then of Athens and Atlantis can symbolize oppositions very high up and down the whole hierarchy. Although, as I said, it looked like Proclus was saying that ultimately we should interpret the symbolism as celestial versus sublunar. But we'll keep going. Moreover, if we consider the polity of Plato as analogous in every respect to the world, it is necessary that we should survey this war as existing in every nature. For the polity is analogous to existence and essences, but war to the powers of these essences, and as Plato says, to their motions. Okay, so that's obviously much broader than celestial versus sublunar. Here we are looking at this fundamental opposition subsisting in all natures throughout the cosmos. We must likewise refer the polity, by making it common to all things, to the whole union of things. But it must be said that war is to be assimilated to the mundane division and to the empire of victory. Whether, therefore, you give a twofold division of the universe by separating it into the incorporeal and the corporeal, and again divide the incorporeal into the more intellectual and the more material natures, and the corporeal into heaven and generation, and heaven into contrary periods, but generation into opposite powers, or in whatever way you assume this opposite life, whether in the mundane gods or in daimons, in souls or in bodies, you may everywhere transfer the analogies from men to things. Okay, so naturally then, yeah, Proclus is saying all of these levels of interpretation do work. Well, this is a narration that is in every respect true, so actually we should expect it to work at every possible one of these levels. For of the gods themselves, the divine Homer makes oppositions, representing Apollo as hostilely opposed to Neptune. I'm going to try to use the Greek terms instead. Ares to Athena, the river Xanthus to Hephaestus, Hermes to Latona, I don't know who Latona is, and Hera to Artemis. For it is requisite to survey generation in incorporeal natures, in bodies, and in both. Okay. I'm going to look up Latona real quick. Leto in Roman mythology. Goddess and mother of Apollo and Artemis, daughter of the Titans Coeus and Phoebe, sister of Asteria. Okay. That's enough on her. Back to Proclus. It is likewise necessary to consider Neptune is, of course, Poseidon. Likewise necessary to consider Poseidon and Apollo as the fabricators of the whole of generation, the one totally, but the other partially. Okay, but Hera and Artemis as the suppliers of vivification, the former rationally, but the latter physically. Athena and Ares as the causes of the contrariety which pervades through both existence and life, the former of that which is defined according to intellect, but the latter of that which is more material and passive. Hermes and Latona as presiding over the twofold perfection of souls, the former indeed over the perfection which is obtained through the Gnostic powers and the evolution into light of productive principles, but the latter over the smooth, spontaneous, and voluntary elevation which is acquired through the vital powers. Okay, so all of these oppositions symbolize supplying different aspects of creation. Vulcan and Xanthus as the primary leaders of the whole of a corporeal constitution and of the powers it contains, the former of those that are more efficacious, but the latter of those that are more passive and, as it were, more material. But he leaves Venus by herself in order that she may illuminate all things with union and harmony. So Aphrodite, beauty, and represents her as fighting on the worse side because the one in those that belong to this side is less excellent than multitude. For all contrariety is surveyed in a becoming manner in conjunction with a unity, which is either prior to it or connascent with, or is in a certain respect an adjunct posterior to it. And Plato, as well as theologists, rightly perceiving that this is the case, have delivered a multitudinous contrariety prior to the one fabrication of the world, and parts prior to wholes. Finding likewise these things in images prior to paradigms, he surveys this contrariety in men, which also has an analogous subsistence in wholes, neither being in want of titanic or gigantic wars. For how could he narrate such wars to Socrates, who on the preceding day had blamed the poets for devising things of this kind? Receiving, therefore, transactions from history in order that he might not assert of the gods that they fight with each other, he ascribes these battles to men, but through a cautious and pious analogy transfers them also to the gods. For such like wars are delivered by divinely inspired poets prior to the one order of things. Their mode, however, of narrating them is adapted to them, but the present mode to Plato, the latter in conjunction with the political science being more moderate, but the former in conjunction with the telestic art being more replete with divine inspiration. Telestic just being mystic, essentially. And thus much concerning the whole of the text. Okay, so this is pretty interesting that we have a detailed breakdown of what these gods from the Odyssey and Iliad, I guess mostly the Iliad, what these gods from the Iliad symbolize. And he's saying it symbolizes the same basic kind of contrariety and conflict underlying the world at its various grades. So whether we're talking about the corporeal or life of souls or whole of generation in its totality. So if we ever look over the Iliad, it might be a good idea to come back and memorize what these gods are said to represent by Proclus. All of these Platonists obviously would be very familiar with Homer. That was part of the curriculum as well, in a certain sense. They would go through like the playwrights and poets as part of a general education before then beginning on Aristotle, and then after Aristotle, Plato. So if we were going to do this curriculum in like the most comprehensive way, we would actually be starting with Homer and then read the poets and playwrights and then get started on Aristotle, and then like the capstone would be the Iamblichian sequence of dialogues. Okay. Moving on. In what is said by Critias, however, the word here is proverbial and is employed in those things to which we wish to call the attention of the hearer. Okay. And what was that from the quote? Let's go back up and see. That quote was a while ago, yeah. So Critias said, "Hear then, O Socrates, a narration surprising indeed in the extreme, yet in every respect true." So here is, did he say ironic? 1 second. Yeah, in what is said by Critias, however, the word here, not ironic, but proverbial. Here is proverbial, and is employed in those things to which we wish to call the attention of the hearer. The word here, therefore, is equivalent to receive what is worthy of attention. But the word surprising, atakon, I think, manifests that which happens contrary to expectation. As in the Gorgias, it is surprising, O Socrates. O topa ge o Socrates. Or that which is paradoxical, as in the Credo. What a surprising dream, Socrates. Os atapon enuption, O Socrates. Or the wonderful, as in the Theaetetus. And it is not at all surprising, but it would be much more wonderful if it were not a thing of this kind. We're going to skip that Greek. But here it is assumed as that which deserves admiration. Okay. This, however, is evident from what follows, in which it is said that the deeds of this city were great and admirable. All right. So this term, surprising, can have different connotations, but because he says here, up front, that kind of signals that what's going to be said is worthy of attention. And then he does say the deeds of this city were great and admirable, coming up. Moreover, the word narration, logos, manifests the truth of what is going to be related. For thus it is said in the Gorgias that a fable differs from logos, because the latter is true and the former is not. It is also very properly said that Solon was the wisest of the 7 wise men, as being asserted of one who was related to Plato, as being said to another Athenian, and in the Panathenaea, and as indicating that the ensuing narration extends to all wisdom. Okay? So several layers of meaning and referencing Solon there. And of course, this conference would have taken place during the Panathenea if it occurred over multiple days. But okay. Not sure about that. Nor is it requisite to wonder how Solon is said to be the wisest of all the 7 wise men, nor to be anxious to know how he can be said to be the wisest of other men, but one of the wise men, when all of them were most wise. For what absurdity is there in calling a man the wisest of those that are of the same order with himself? But his legislation, his pretended insanity at Salamis, his armed attack of Pisistratus the tyrant, who said he was more prudent than those that were absent, and more brave than those that were present, his conference also with Croesus, and his answer to one who said that he had established most beautiful laws, for he replied that he had not established the most beautiful, but powerful laws, and that he knew laws that were more excellent than these. All these particulars bear testimony to his wisdom. There is likewise a story told of a tripod that was dragged up in a net by certain young men, though it is not related by all historians, and that the oracle of Apollo being consulted on this occasion, the god answered that it should be given to the wisest man. That in consequence of this, it was offered to Thales, but he sent it to another of the 7 wise men, this again to another, and so on, till at last it came to Solon, all of them yielding it to him. Solon, however, sent it to the god, saying that he was the wisest of beings. Solon also is said to have found that the lunar month does not consist of 30 days, and on this account he was the first that called it en neon, a new one, and neos, new. And in short, the discovery that the numbers of the days revert from the 20th day is ascribed to him. Not sure what that means. Some also assert that prior to Anaxagoras, Solon showed that intellect presided over the whole of things, from all of which it is evident that he was a participant of a certain wisdom. So that story involving the tripod is found in Diogenes Laertius and I think some other sources. It's interesting that some assert that Solon had the idea that intellect was the governing principle of reality prior to Anaxagoras. And the other guy who was associated with that view that we ran across in another reading group earlier today was, what was that guy's name? Hermotimus of Clazomenae, who is also said to be a previous incarnation of Pythagoras, prior to Pythagoras, flourished the, I think, 8th or 7th century BC, so if he was historical, very early figure. But Aristotle said that he, what was his name again? I just said it. Hermotimus. Yeah, thank you. Hermotimus, Aristotle said, had the same belief about intellect, and now here Proclus is saying some ascribe that same view to Solon. So, some trivia to remember. We'll keep going. Quote, Solon, then, was the familiar and intimate friend of our great-grandfather Dropides, as he himself frequently relates in his poems. But he once declared to our grandfather Critias, as the old man himself informed us, that great and admirable actions had once been achieved by this city, which nevertheless were buried in oblivion through length of time, and the destruction of mankind. Proclus, the history of the race of Solon and of the alliance of Plato to him is as follows. The children of Execestides were Solon and Dropides, and of Dropides Critias was the son, who is mentioned by Solon in his poems, where he sings, Bid Critias with the yellow locks attention to his father pay, for by revering what he says no faulty leader he'll obey. But Calascris and Glaucon were the sons of Critias, and again the Critias of the present dialogue was the son of Calascris. This, however, is evident from Critias in the Charmides calling the father of Charmides his uncle. but Charmides, and Perictione were the offspring of Glaucon, and Perictione was the mother of Plato. So that Glaucon was the uncle of Critias, but the father of Charmides, and Charmides was the uncle of Plato. But Solon was the brother of the great-grandfather of Critias. Such, therefore, is the truth respecting the race of Solon. The divine Iamblichus, however, gives a different account of the succession of his race, for he immediately makes Glaucon to be the son of Dropides, but others, as the Platonic Theon, so probably Theon of Smyrna, assert that Critias and Glaucon were the sons of Calascris, though in the Charmides, Critias says that Charmides is the son of Glaucon, our uncle, but is my cousin. Hence, Glaucon is not the son of Dropides, nor the brother of the younger Critias. To a man, however, who pays attention to things, it is of no consequence in whatever manner these particulars may subsist. Passing on, therefore, to things, you may assume that these particulars as images, from these particulars as images, that all the discord of the world and the twofold coordinations that are in it are suspended from proximate demiurgic causes, and are referred to other, more intellectual and ancient causes, that the causes of this motion are continuous and united, and suspended from one cause, that the superior causes are more ancient in intellection, and that secondary receive the production of primary natures, receive from and yet have a connascent communion with them. In addition to these things also, you may assume that a twofold oblivion is produced in souls of the theory of great and admirable wholes. So a twofold ignorance is produced about the theory of wholes, so I guess the theory of forms, arising either from having abandoned for a long time a life of that kind, so it's been a long time since you've made contact with the intelligibles, or through having fallen immoderately into generation. So an intense fall or a long duration of fall of soul leads to that oblivion. For this is for the real man to be truly corrupted. Okay? But souls that have been recently perfected and retain the memory of things in the intelligible world, in consequence of not falling into matter, easily acquire a reminiscence of the truth, and thus much for these particulars. We must not, however, wonder if Critias calls Solon simply a familiar, for we not only call those with whom we associate, but also our kindred familiars. But by likewise adding, and an intimate friend, he indicates that there was not merely a communion of race, but a sameness and similitude of life in the ancestors of Plato. The prior Critias also is called an old man, which signifies his possession of prudence and intellect, and his being adapted to many disciplines. Okay, how long is this next section? I want to do one more section. Quote, in particular, he informed me of one undertaking surpassing in magnitude all the rest, which I now think proper to relate to you, both that I may repay my obligations, and that by such a relation I may offer my tribute of praise to the goddess in the present solemnity, by celebrating her divinity, as it were, with hymns, justly and in a manner agreeable to truth. Right, so this is still during the Pan-Athenaean festival. Proclus. Longinus doubts what was the intention of Plato in the assertion of this narration, for he does not introduce it either for the purpose of giving respite to the auditors or as being in want of it, for the narration of Atlantis generally, I think. And he dissolves the doubt, as he thinks, by saying that it is assumed by Plato prior to physiology in order to allure the reader and soften the severity of that kind of writing. But Origen says that the narration is indeed a fiction, and so far he agrees with Numenius and his followers, but he does not admit with Longinus that it was devised for the sake of pleasure. He does not, however, add the cause of the fiction. Well, I mean, we had Origen giving a metaphorical interpretation before. Origen was the one that said it was two different orders of soul that were at war with one another. Okay. We, therefore, have frequently said that it contributes to the whole theory of nature, And we likewise say that in these words, Plato calls the one and common productive principle of the twofold coordinations in the world, and the one contrariety which pervades through wholes, the greatest and most admirable of works, as containing the other fabrication of things in infrangible bonds. This fabrication consisting of participations of the contraries, bound and infinity, as Philolaus says, and as Plato, who asserts in the Philebus. For he there says, quote, that there is much bound and much infinity in the world, which are things most contrary to each other, and give completion to this universe. Since, however, all things that contribute to the production of the world are said to recompense the benefits bestowed by total causes, Critias says very properly that it becomes him to repay his obligations to Socrates, who excited both the second and third powers. These things, therefore, may be immediately assumed from the words before us. I don't know about immediately. Seems like, some kind of sophisticated interpretation and allegorical reading has to be done. So here we say that, or he says that, like, inferior natures recompense the benefits bestowed by more total causes, which, lends towards this view that higher beings actually do get something from lower beings. Sometimes Proclus seems to talk about that kind of hierarchy as the higher contain everything they need completely from themselves and then just give as kind of like a donation their own excellences to the next order beneath them. But they don't gain anything in doing that. It's just purely providential. Here, though, he says, all things contribute to the production of the world, are said to recompense the benefits bestowed by total causes. Or maybe the sense of this sentence is a little bit different here. Specifically, all things that contribute to the production of the world, so even mundane causes that render the world complete, recompense the benefits bestowed by total causes. So the partial aspects of the world receive benefits from the forms, and then they recompense benefits by contributing to the, like assisting the forms, assisting the demiurge in the construction of the world. Maybe that's the meaning. So there is a kind of reciprocal involvement from below and from above, because they're both contributing in the construction of a common thing. Of course, does the demiurge benefit from the construction of that thing? I don't think the evidence is there directly in the text, but the demiurge does obviously want to create it, so presumably he gets something out of being prolific. Yeah, that might be one benefit that superiors receive from inferiors that Proclus does talk about, that if they don't create them, then the superiors aren't prolific and aren't therefore as great as they otherwise would be. So, all right. But will you not say that the Athenian solemnity has an indication of demiurgic works? For the goddess herself, indeed, connectedly contains all the mundane fabrication, and possesses intellectual lives in herself, according to which she weaves together the universe and unifying powers, according to which she governs all the mundane oppositions. The emorwoll solemnity, however, indicates the gift of the goddess, which pervades through all things and fills all things with herself, and likewise the union which extends through all variety. For in solemnities we especially embrace a common and concordant life. Okay, and that fits with Athens symbolizing what is like more united, concentrated, singular. And then the Atlantines, led by Poseidon, who is a god of procession, more multitudinous, dispersed, veering towards matter. If, however, we have asserted these things rightly, we may from these transfer ourselves to the various and one life of the world, and survey the difference between the Parmenides in this dialogue. For both have their hypothesis in the Panathenaea, but the former in the greater, and the latter in the lesser of these solemnities. for they were celebrated about the same time with the Bendidian festival, and this very properly. For since the productions of Minerva are twofold, total and partial, supermundane and mundane, intelligible and sensible, the former of these solemnities indeed pertains to the exempt productions of the goddess, which relates to the Parmenides dialogue, unfolding into light the intelligible series of the gods, but the latter to her subordinate productions, interpreting the powers of the gods about the world. And the Bendidian festival indeed appears to manifest the suppression of the contrariety externally exceeded to the universe from a barbaric tempest by the gods, who are the inspective guardians of the festival. Okay, so the Bendidian festival is like a kind of domain of order in a otherwise more chaotic universe. Hence, it is said to have been celebrated in the Piraeus as being most adapted to the extremities and material parts of the universe. And so the Bendidian festival being meant to suppress the contrariety takes place in a place that has a reputation for extremes. The Piraeus, of course, is where trade would take place. It's the port at Athens. And it also had like its own red light district kind of thing, supposedly. Let's see. I was just going to look up. I thought the Bendidian festival was like a festival around Athena, but I could be wrong. Bendidian festival. Okay. The Bendidia was an ancient Athenian festival celebrating the Thracian goddess Bendis. It was celebrated on the 19th day of the month of Targelion, late May. Okay. The festival took place in the Piraeus. It was rare for ancient Athens to permit foreign residents of the city to worship their own gods. The cult of Bendis and the Bendidia is one of a few exceptions. It says because Thrace was strategically important as an ally for Athens during the Peloponnesian War, so that's why they, I guess, granted this kind of special favor to Thracians in the Piraeus. The Bendidia began with a procession to the sanctuary of Bendis. Worshippers coming from Athens processed from the Prytaneion, while the Thracian worshippers of Bendis in the Piraeus organized a separate procession, possibly organized so that it would join up with the Athenian contingent before they arrived at the sanctuary. The procession from Athens, 6 miles from the sanctuary, was provided with sponges and basins in which to wash and garlands. The celebrants then ate lunch in the precinct of the sanctuary. After dark, there was a horseback relay race with the riders passing torches. The horseback race was a Thracian feature of the festival, as such races at Athenian festivals were usually performed on foot, and Thracians were famous for their equestrianism, though it is unknown if similar races were also held in Thrace itself. The horse race was followed by an all-night celebration, though the precise details of the remainder of the festival are unknown. Okay, so you have like two processions, one from Athens of Athenians, one from the Piraeus of Thracians. So you can already see in the Bendidian festival this kind of coordination of contrarieties. So Proclus is vindicated there. All right, but the Panathenaean festival exhibits the established order which proceeds into the world from intellect and the unconfused separation of mundane contrarieties. For this goddess is at one and the same time a lover of wisdom and a lover of war. Another veil, therefore, was referred to the goddess in the Bendidian festival, representing the war in which the pupils of Minerva were victorious, just as the veil in the Panathenaean solemnity represented the giants vanquished by the Olympian gods. The goddess, however, is celebrated with hymns, justly, and with truth. Justly, indeed, because it is necessary that everything which has preceded should be converted to its proper principle, but with truth, because the hymn is assumed through things and through beings. And because of hymns, some celebrate the essence, but others the providence of the gods, and others praise the works that proceed from them. And a hymn of this kind is the last form of celebration. For the praise of the divine essence precedes all other panegyrics, as Socrates asserts in the Symposium. This being the case, the words celebrating, as it were, are very properly added. For he wishes to celebrate the goddess from the deeds performed by the Athenians, but that the Panathenaean followed the Bendidian festivals is asserted both by the commentators and by Aristotle the Rhodian. For they say that the Bendidia were celebrated in the Piraeus on the 20th day of April, but that the festivals sacred to Minerva followed these. Okay, well, that's where we're going to stop. We had a different date given by Wikipedia for the Bendidian festival. It was set, they said like the 19th day of Thargelion, which doesn't quite correspond to May, but may have been in late May. So we're not going to account for this calendrical discrepancy. Probably not too important, but all right. Any thoughts in general on the reading today? I thought there was a lot of good stuff this time. We got more clarification on the demiurgic triad. We got more dimensions of the analogy that's being referred to with the War of Athens and Atlantis. We got Proclus's take on that clarified. Like I said before, it kind of appeared that he was saying it's celestial versus sublunar, but no, it appeared, or rather applies at all of these various levels of interpretation to souls, to daimons, to the cosmos itself, between the order of the same, or the circle of the same rather, and the circle of the other, as Amelius thought, and none of these have to conflict. The narration can be true in all of these senses, and that's no problem. That's one of the beauties of Neoplatonism, that all of these various interpretations can coexist very often. Tomer?
What I think that wasn't clear for me is that the opposition between the same and the other. At one point, he says that the ideal state is the Athenian state that is in the order of the same, but then he says that both orders are involved in generation, so there is a certain unity of both orders working together, or are they forever striving against each other?
Well, yeah, you would expect both to apply in both. Like the Athenian state doesn't represent the same exempt from the other. It represents the same in its kind of dialectical contest with the other. And so it contains an element of alterity as well as similarity in itself, but appropriate to its own level. I think that would be a fair kind of interpretation. But yeah, ultimately, this all does come down to, I think, the same versus the other. Well, I suppose most ultimately, the monad versus indefinite dyad. But as far as the forms that are being discussed here, the same and the other are the two antithetical elements of the soul, and we'll see reflections of that throughout the corporeal order of the cosmos as well, because that is modeled on the soul, just as the soul is modeled on the intelligible paradigms before it. So yeah, a lot of good stuff in this one. Looking forward to resuming. I will try to find more time during the week to get more sessions in. This week was a little busy, or maybe I was just distracted. But we will get through this thing. Thanks